Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple. I write the Ann Kinnear Suspense Novels and suspense shorts in the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, and I also write, speak, podcast, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors two questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from that book that they would like to share with their fellow writers? And what did they learn that they would like to share with their fellow readers? And I am joined today by Amy Weinland Daughters. Hey, Amy, how are you doing?
Great, Maddie. Thanks for having me on.
I am pleased to have you here and to give our viewers a little background on you. Amy Weinland Daughters is a keynote speaker, letter writer, satirist, sports journalist, and the award winning author of two books, Dear Dana, That Time I Went Crazy and Wrote All 580 of My Facebook Friends a Handwritten Letter, and You Cannot Mess This Up, A True Story That Never Happened. She is absolutely convinced that when human beings connect individually in a meaningful way, that nothing can separate them. And so today I am here talking with Amy about You Cannot Mess This Up. So, Amy, let's start with the first of the two What I Learned questions. What did you learn that you would like to share with your fellow writers?
Well, I learned, You Cannot Mess This Up is a kind of a memoir wrapped up in the tortilla of fictional time travel. So I write myself back to my own childhood in 1978, where I visit as a distant cousin that no one knows who I am, but I have to deal with the emotional landmines of visiting my parents at my same age in the story and then seeing my childhood self. But in the process of writing the book, I wanted to write a funny time travel book. It turned out to be way more than that because there were so many feelings associated with a return to one's childhood. But my favorite part of writing the book was the research that I delved into to take the reader back to 1978. And I did that kind of as an indulgent exercise because I wanted to go back in time. But I spent so much time researching this book I spent a couple weeks in the Houston, Texas library reading every newspaper, every periodical I could get my hands on at the time. I watched YouTube videos, I bought Sears catalogs, and I didn't use all of my research, obviously. I had a great editor who was like, "Okay, that's funny, and we can't do any more 1978." But all of those details, all of that work paid off in a way that I never could have imagined because so many readers contact me and said, "Oh my gosh, it was like I literally went back the descriptiveness." And it came down to my absolute it's my personality more than I'm just some dogged researcher, but my personality was just to get so deeply into it and all those little details. I couldn't have known they just transported so many strangers back to this world with me. And I think that's one of the absolute, and I'm not saying this as the writer of the book, I'm proud of it, but it was an absolute delight to the reader that I didn't know I was gonna provide, but it was detail after detail after dogged detail, and then the other processes of finding someone who could see the forest for the trees, helping me sift through which part of this we were gonna meld together to make this story part nostalgia and part something someone wanted to listen to. So I guess my takeaway is all those little steps we take as writers, and I think it's down to the passions that we have. We're given those for a reason, and I think it's easy to get distracted and say, "This isn't nobody really wants to do this." I mean, like, who cares about the Sears catalog and all the outfits that people are gonna wear in this book from 1978? But it turned out by me kinda I wasn't trained professionally as a writer. I have a business degree, and I kind of fell into writing because we moved to the UK for 3 years, and I was taken out of my job. And I've always liked to write, so I began to freelance write, and I think I spent so much time getting in my own way to where I finally realized, "Look, this is my voice, this is what I wanna write about." And when I immersed myself completely into that, Maddie, that's when not only did I do whatever was good for me, but that's when these readers I never knew about, that I never knew I was gonna have in my life, that's when I gave them my best stuff, was what in me, and when I stopped questioning that and dove into the Sears catalog, there you had it.
I still remember having a Sears catalog, and there was one, female model that I thought, "Oh, this is the person I want to grow up to be." I loved her hair. I loved, like, what she looked like. I had a little crush on the Sears catalog model. I'm pretty sure it was Sears catalog. But how did your editor advise you when you had to sift through all the details you had and identify the ones that, were gonna make it into the book?
Um, that's a great question, and I think it was kind of on a case by case basis because me, like everyone else, I was in love with all of it. Because I procured it, and for a reason, I picked the stuff that I was most passionate about, and I had to get to the point where you weren't gonna overwhelm the reader. And so we picked the best of the best. And the book is humorous. So I think the humor tack, we took the things that maybe would make people laugh at the same time that they would make them remember and realize that quantity is not always quality, and even shortening memories down to 4 or 5 words rather than going on and adding the description just to certain parts. Because what I found was in when you're working with people's memories and nostalgia, just a couple words can evoke an entire flood of memories. So if you kick it off with a couple great descriptions and then just mention stuff, interweave those, that's a really good strategy.
Do you feel like there was one detail you pulled from your research that was especially evocative of that period?
You know, there was surprises for sure, but I think the one detail as I watched, because there's a scene where we were watching TV, it was like November, it's Thanksgiving of 1978, and looking at the commercials, like every single commercial that I watched from that time period, because I literally went back and watched some of the shows and tried to get the commercials from those months. There was so much singing. There was so many B-rate singers singing, like belting out these songs about Tame soap and, I was like up with people had gone mad. And as a viewer in 2015 and 16, when I was writing, researching this book, I could not believe how much bad singing there was. Everything was presented in song. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But I tried to have that come across because in the print ads, I was completely amazed that there was so much less photography and so much more drawn models. Like if you look at a Macy's ad, Foley's was the company in Houston. Like everybody got bought out by Macy's, but Macy's is a good one everybody remembers. But they would draw out the clothes in black and white rather than take pictures of them. Like over and over again, it was like this real 70s style. But that really stood out to me as well. It's like we were being advertised to completely differently and we'd forgotten about it.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Even just hearing those couple of things that you're mentioning, I'm like, oh, yeah, I can put myself back in that
Right.
position. So, those are a couple of insights that you gained that you'd like to share with your fellow writers. How about your fellow readers? What would you like to share from You Cannot Mess This Up that you'd like to share with your fellow readers?
Well, I think that it's interesting because I mentioned I went into the book thinking my whole intention was I'm going to write a funny back in time book. Like if people laugh, then I've achieved my biggest goal. And that absolutely did happen. But as I mentioned, when I wrote myself back into my childhood, and this is so relatable because if you wrote yourself back to when you were 10 and entered into this whole foray as an adult who's lived 45 years of your life, and watching your 10-year-old self interact in the world and watching your mother deal with real life and how relatable that is. I wrote a catharsis without knowing it. And I think it made me realize that wasn't really in my wheelhouse as a reader. I wasn't one prone to write. I read all kinds of stuff. I'm kind of more of a nonfiction reader, which is funny. And but I wrote this book and realized what there is just in listening to people who read it, which is super gratifying, which a lot of people can relate to because they were like, "Oh my gosh, I went back in time and visited my version of Little Amy in reading your book." And I realized that there's whole other genre of books that I'm really attracted to that I did not engage with prior to writing this book. And I think it's such a great lesson that we talk about this as readers, and I'm a bigger reader than I am a writer probably, is that when we open up and introduce ourselves to other genres that we're not interested in, all of a sudden there's this whole other world out there for us. And writing this book made me realize that I need to step out and be like, beach reads. I need to get into that mystery, suspense, horror. Because of writing this book, I wasn't a Stephen King reader, but I read several Stephen King books, and it taught me to open myself up. And I think it's such a great lesson as a human being to open ourselves up to things, especially in our divisive culture that we don't maybe understand right now. But if we did, but not only does it enhance our experience as a human being, but it makes us realize the world's much bigger than what we think it is in our hand. And that's the gift of reading, really.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. I really like that idea that if you approach a genre that you don't normally read with that idea of learning from it, and not being entertained by it. So, I am not normally a horror reader, but I have read some horror books in preparation for podcast episode interviews with horror writers.
right,
And if I sat down and said, now I'm going to have a jolly time this evening, like normally I like to read for escapism. If
right.
I approached a horror novel like that, I probably would put it down quickly. But if I was reading it with that mindset of what am I going to learn from this experience, then I probably stick with it. And then I probably actually would learn something from it because I'm bringing that different mindset to it.
Right. That approach that's a brilliant way to look at it because
Mm,
if we all approach that things that way, I mean, we would be better for it. We would.
yeah. This is a little off topic, but it made me think of it when you were talking about looking at old ads and everybody was singing. And were you a watcher of Mad Men?
Yes.
And there was think I'm remembering this right, that at the end, it turned out that he had written the "I'd like to teach the world to sing" Coke ad, and, I thought that was a brilliant, not only a brilliant way to end the episode, but I think it's super fun in bringing 2 seemingly unrelated storylines together in that way, which is what you're doing with your book, like, you're bringing together yourself as an adult and yourself as a child. I think that's a really clever way of going about examining a childhood in a way that's different than other sort of memoir books have done.
Right. And it was less I think one of the things I like about it, it's full of nostalgia for sure, but it was less it kind of takes that sheen off the memory because you look at yourself, it's more I don't know, it's hard to put into words, but it's more realistic than saying, "Oh, I remember this golden age of Hot Wheels and Big Wheels and Barbies and Donnie and Marie." In confronting myself and actually having a conversation with myself, it was more like because my initial reaction to myself was, "Oh my god, she has a bowl cut and she's nuts." And by the end of the story, I wanna be her because I forgot about not only am I scared to death of her, but, oh my gosh, I've lived a lot of my best qualities away when I've sat down to talk to her. And so, it's a little more unvarnished. It's not like when we look back and everything's golden and there's unicorns and rainbows. And I think that's why it's a more valuable experience because of that.
Yeah, that's so great. Well, the whole concept is just so fascinating, Amy, and I appreciate you chatting about it with me. And I know that we have intrigued listeners to learn more about You Cannot Mess This Up. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
If you go to amydaughters.com, that's all the information about me and both my books. And I love to hear from people. And one of the best things about this whole journey has been people relating their memories from the 70s. So feel free to hit the email button and because I will have a great conversation with you about that.
That's so great. Thank you so much.